June 4, 1942. 10:22 a.m. 19,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's fuel gauge was nudging empty. His 37 Dauntless dive bombers had been searching for the Japanese carrier fleet for over an hour, burning fuel they couldn't afford to lose. The ocean below stretched endlessly in every direction, blue, empty, mocking. His radio crackled with anxious voices. Pilots were calculating whether they had enough fuel to return to Enterprise. Some wouldn't make it back even if they turned around now. Then McCluskey saw it. A single Japanese destroyer cutting through the water at high speed, leaving a white wake that pointed northeast like an arrow. It was racing somewhere urgent. McCluskey made a decision that would change history. He banked hard and followed the wake. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and which World War II dive bomber you think was the most devastating. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and give this video a thumbs up if you're ready to discover how 6 minutes of violence from the sky altered the course of the entire Pacific War. Your support helps us keep telling these incredible stories. 4 minutes later, McCluskey's radio man tapped his shoulder and pointed down. Through a gap in the clouds, the sea was crowded with ships. 3 massive aircraft carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, sat exposed and vulnerable, their flight decks packed with aircraft being fueled and armed. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked everywhere. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the decks. The Japanese were preparing their own strike against the American carriers, never expecting an attack at this moment. McCluskey realized something that sent ice through his veins. If he attacked now, he would commit his entire squadron with no reserve, no second chance, and possibly not enough fuel to return home. If he was wrong about the timing, if Japanese fighters rose to meet them, his men would die for nothing. But the Japanese carriers sat there, fat with munitions, their decks transformed into floating bombs waiting for a match. He keyed his radio. Attack, attack. And in that moment, as his Dauntless rolled into its dive, Wade McCluskey had already won the Pacific War. He just didn't know it yet. In 1938, the U.S. Navy issued requirements for a new scout bomber to replace the aging Northrop BT-1. Douglas Aircraft submitted a design so conservative it bordered on boring. Low-mounted wings, a 2-man crew, perforated dive brakes, no dramatic inverted gull wings like the German Stuka, no psychological warfare sirens, just a workmanlike aircraft built to dive, bomb, and return home. The Navy ordered 57 pre-production models and designated them Scout Bomber Douglas SBD. American pilots would eventually nickname it Slow But Deadly, acknowledging its modest 255 mph top speed while respecting something harder to quantify. The Dauntless was reliable. It was rugged. And when a pilot pushed it into a 70-degree dive through walls of anti-aircraft fire, it stayed stable and controllable when other aircraft would have shaken apart. By December 1941, Dauntlesses equipped most U.S. Navy and Marine Corps dive bomber squadrons. They were present at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, not as attackers but as victims, caught on the ground or returning from reconnaissance flights. 18 were destroyed. The pilots who survived that morning learned a bitter lesson about unpreparedness. But within 6 months, those same pilots would teach the Japanese Navy a lesson about precision that would echo through history. The Battle of Midway was never supposed to happen the way it did. Japanese Admiral Yamamoto planned to lure the American carriers into a trap, destroy them, and force the United States to negotiate peace. He commanded 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the veteran ships that had struck Pearl Harbor. These carriers represented Japan's offensive striking power, crewed by pilots who had trained for years and mechanics who could rearm aircraft in minutes. The Americans had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been heavily damaged at the Coral Sea just a month earlier, patched together in an emergency 3-day repair that should have taken 3 months. She sailed with civilian workers still aboard, welding and hammering as she headed into battle. The Americans had one advantage Yamamoto didn't know about. They had broken Japanese naval codes. They knew Midway was the target. They knew when the Japanese would arrive, and they positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. June 4th began badly for the Americans. The Japanese struck Midway Atoll at dawn, bombing installations and engaging defending fighters. American torpedo bombers launched from all three carriers to attack the Japanese fleet. 41 Devastator torpedo bombers pressed their attacks at wave-top level, slow and vulnerable, flying straight into concentrated anti-aircraft fire and Japanese Zero fighters. 35 were shot down. The crews that survived the crashes drowned in the Pacific or died from exposure. Only 6 Devastators returned to their carriers. Not a single torpedo hit. The sacrifice wasn't meaningless. Those torpedo bombers drew Japanese fighters down to sea level, pulling them out of position. The sky above the Japanese carriers was clear when McCluskey's dive bombers arrived at 10:22 a.m. McCluskey's fuel situation was now critical. Half his pilots had already radioed that they wouldn't make it back to Enterprise. Some had dropped their bombs in the ocean to save weight and turned for home, hoping to ditch near American ships. McCluskey had been searching for 2 hours based on outdated position reports. The Japanese carriers should have been there. They weren't. Then he saw that destroyer, racing northeast at 30 knots. Ships don't race alone unless they're rejoining their fleet. McCluskey turned his formation and followed the wake. His pilots were silent on the radio now. They knew they were committed. Return was no longer possible. They would find the Japanese carriers and attack, or they would ditch in the ocean when their fuel ran out. There was no third option. At 10:20 a.m., through a gap in the clouds at 19,000 feet, McCluskey saw them. 3 carriers in a rough triangle, maybe 5 miles apart. Flight decks crowded with aircraft. No combat air patrol overhead. The Zeros were still climbing back to altitude after massacring the torpedo bombers. McCluskey didn't hesitate. He radioed Enterprise's 2nd Squadron, leading them toward Kaga. He would take Akagi himself. The radio man in his rear seat, seeing the carriers for the first time, later said he felt his stomach drop before the dive even began. The Dauntless nosed over and accelerated toward the ocean. The dive angle was 70 degrees, nearly vertical. The perforated dive brakes deployed, keeping the speed controllable and the aircraft stable. Through his gun sight, McCluskey could see Kaga's flight deck growing larger. Aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip, fuel hoses, bomb carts, men running. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air. Black puffs of exploding shells surrounded the diving Dauntlesses. Some aircraft were hit immediately, wings shredded, engines bursting into flame, plunging uncontrolled into the sea. But the others held their dives. 70 degrees, 65 degrees. The G-forces mounted as they plunged faster. The ocean rushed up to meet them. At 2,500 feet, McCluskey centered Kaga's flight deck in his sight. At 1,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and hauled back on the stick. The Dauntless groaned under 6 times the force of gravity, the dive brakes screaming, the airframe shuddering as it clawed out of the dive barely 50 feet above the water. Behind him, his bomb fell true. Above, 36 more Dauntlesses followed him down. The bomb struck Kaga first. 3 direct hits within seconds. One penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, igniting fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion ripped through the carrier like a blowtorch through paper. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes cooked off. Secondary explosions tore through the hull. Within minutes, Kaga was a floating inferno, her crew abandoning ship. Simultaneously, dive bombers from Enterprise hit Akagi, Yamamoto's flagship. 4 bombs struck within a minute. One penetrated near the bridge, killing or wounding most of the command staff. Another hit amidships, rupturing fuel lines and setting the hangar ablaze. Akagi's captain ordered the ship abandoned at 10:46 a.m., just 24 minutes after the attack began. Soryu took 3 direct hits. Her aviation fuel ignited immediately, the flames spreading so fast her crew couldn't reach firefighting equipment. She was abandoned at 10:45 a.m., but the battle wasn't over. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was operating separately, and her location remained unknown. Her scout planes spotted Yorktown at 11 a.m. and Hiryu launched a strike immediately. 18 Val dive bombers escorted by Zeros. Yorktown's radar detected them at 12 miles. American fighters scrambled to intercept, but some Japanese bombers penetrated the defensive screen. At 12:20 p.m., Val dive bombers screamed down through anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky black with exploding shells. 3 bombs struck Yorktown. One hit amidships, penetrating 4 decks and igniting fires. Another ruptured her smokestack, reducing her speed. The third exploded near the island, destroying radar equipment. Damage control teams performed miracles. Within 2 hours, fires were extinguished, speed restored to 19 knots, and Yorktown was recovering aircraft again. Observing Japanese pilots reported she had been sunk, and Hiryu launched a second strike of torpedo bombers. At 2:42 p.m., 10 Kate torpedo bombers attacked Yorktown. 2 torpedoes struck her port side, flooding engine rooms and knocking out power. Yorktown listed 17 degrees and lost all propulsion. Her captain ordered abandon ship at 3:00 p.m., but Hiryu's location had been reported. At 3:30 p.m., 24 Dauntlesses from Enterprise and orphaned Yorktown aircraft found her. They rolled into their dives at 5 p.m., the late afternoon sun behind them, diving out of the sun just as Japanese pilots had done at Pearl Harbor. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession. Her flight deck erupted in flames. Secondary explosions tore through her hull as fueled aircraft and armed ordnance cooked off. By nightfall, she was burning uncontrollably, her captain committing ritual suicide on the bridge as his ship died around him. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 4 fleet carriers that had taken 4 years to build, were burning wrecks. 3 had been scuttled by Japanese destroyers to prevent capture. Hiryu would burn through the night before sinking at dawn. With them went 248 aircraft and more than 3,000 sailors, including dozens of Japan's most experienced pilots and mechanics, irreplaceable specialists who had trained for years. The United States lost Yorktown, finally torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine 2 days later while under tow. The destroyer Hammond, alongside assisting the tow, was also sunk. Total American losses: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 personnel. The exchange rate was catastrophic for Japan, 4 carriers for 1. But the strategic implications went far deeper than numbers. Yamamoto had gambled Japan's offensive capability on a single decisive battle. He lost. The 4 carriers sunk at Midway represented half of Japan's large fleet carriers. Their construction had required specialized facilities, skilled workers, and years of building time. Japan's industrial capacity was already strained supplying existing forces. Replacing 4 fleet carriers would take years Japan didn't have. More critically, the pilots were gone. Training a carrier pilot required 2 years minimum, hundreds of hours learning navigation, gunnery, torpedo attacks, and the specialized skill of landing on a moving ship. Japan's naval aviation training program couldn't replace losses at the rate American industrial and training capacity could. Every experienced pilot lost at Midway was effectively irreplaceable. The United States, by contrast, was just beginning to mobilize its vast industrial capacity. In 1942 alone, American shipyards would complete 6 fleet carriers. In 1943, 9 more. In 1944, 8 more, plus dozens of escort carriers. American pilot training programs would graduate thousands of aviators, many logging more training hours than Japanese veterans had accumulated in their entire careers. After Midway, Japan never again possessed the carrier strength to conduct major offensive operations. The initiative passed to the United States. Within 2 months, Marines would land on Guadalcanal, beginning the island-hopping campaign that would drive across the Pacific toward Japan itself. And the weapon that achieved this victory was the Dauntless dive bomber, flown by pilots who pressed their attacks through hell. Consider the mathematics of what they faced. A Dauntless diving at 70 degrees accelerates to over 250 knots. The pilot experiences 6 to 7 times normal gravity, pulling out of the dive. Blood drains from the brain. Vision narrows to a tunnel. Some pilots blacked out, recovering consciousness only after the automatic pull-up system saved them. During the dive, the pilot had to maintain the correct angle while anti-aircraft shells exploded around him. Ignore the tracers streaking past his canopy. Center the target in his gun sight despite the aircraft vibrating and the altimeter unwinding like a broken watch. Release his bomb at precisely the correct altitude, then pull out of the dive before smashing into the ocean or the target itself. The margin for error was seconds. Release too early, the bomb misses. Too late, you can't pull out. Deviate from your dive angle, the bomb goes wide. Hesitate when fire fills the sky around you and you die. Yet McCluskey's pilots achieved a hit rate of approximately 30%. Extraordinary accuracy for dive bombing under combat conditions. Their training, their courage, and their aircraft combined to deliver precision that changed history. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Dauntlesses heavily damaged the carrier Ryujo, contributing to her sinking. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, they damaged the carrier Shokaku again, putting her out of action for 9 months. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, Dauntlesses operating from Henderson Field sank dozens of Japanese ships attempting to reinforce the island. Destroyers, cruisers, and transports torn apart by 1,000-pound bombs delivered with precision. The final statistics are remarkable. The SBD Dauntless sank more enemy shipping than any other Allied aircraft in the Pacific theater. 6 carriers, 14 cruisers, 6 destroyers, dozens of transports and supply ships, thousands of tons of enemy shipping sent to the bottom through precision dive bombing. And it achieved this while suffering the lowest loss rate of any U.S. carrier aircraft. Dauntlesses were rugged enough to absorb damage and keep flying. Pilots loved the aircraft's honest handling. No surprises, no vices, just reliable performance when your life depended on it. The Dauntless remained in frontline service until mid-1944, when the larger, faster Curtiss Helldiver replaced it. Many pilots regretted the change. The Helldiver had better performance on paper, but early models suffered handling problems and structural issues. Dauntless pilots trusted their aircraft. You don't easily give up an aircraft that brought you home through fire and death. Even after being replaced on fleet carriers, Dauntlesses continued serving from escort carriers and land bases until war's end. The last combat mission was flown in 1945. The final aircraft were retired in 1950. Fighter bombers like the F-4U Corsair and F-6F Hellcat could deliver bombs accurately while defending themselves against enemy fighters. The specialized dive bomber, slow and vulnerable, became obsolete almost as quickly as it had emerged. Jets would soon make the entire concept irrelevant, but during their brief moment, dive bombers fundamentally altered naval warfare. They proved that aircraft could sink the largest warships. They demonstrated that carriers were vulnerable to precision attack. They showed that control of the air meant control of the seas. The age of the battleship, which had dominated naval warfare for 300 years, ended not in a climactic gun duel, but beneath dive bombers screaming down from 19,000 feet. The future belonged to carriers, to naval aviation, to the complex ballet of fighters, bombers, and radar that would define modern naval combat. And at Midway, the Dauntless demonstrated this truth with finality. 4 Japanese carriers, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the ships that had struck across the Pacific, were reduced to burning wrecks in 6 minutes, because pilots in stubby little dive bombers held their course through anti-aircraft fire and placed their bombs with precision that artillery could never match. Wade McCluskey survived the war. He received the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. He flew 56 combat missions before being reassigned to training duties. After the war, he commanded carriers, rose to Rear Admiral, and retired in 1956. He rarely spoke publicly about Midway. When asked, he would say simply that he did his duty, that his pilots were brave, and that the Dauntless was a good aircraft. The modest words of a man who changed history. The pilots who followed him into that dive over the Japanese carriers were mostly in their early 20s. Many had been flying for less than 2 years. They volunteered for one of the war's most dangerous specialties, strapping themselves into aircraft that required them to deliberately dive toward concentrated defensive fire, endure crushing G-forces that could knock them unconscious, then pull out with seconds to spare. 54 American pilots and aircrew were killed at Midway. Most died in the torpedo bomber attacks that preceded the dive bombing strikes. Their sacrifice drew Japanese fighters out of position and made McCluskey's attack possible. They dove into certain death and pressed their attacks knowing they wouldn't survive. Their names deserve remembrance: Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, who watched from the water as the Japanese carriers burned. Technology alone doesn't win wars. The Japanese carriers at Midway were crewed by veterans. Their aircraft were excellent. Their tactical doctrine was proven. They had every advantage except one: their enemies were willing to sacrifice everything for victory. The torpedo bomber crews that died in the morning. McCluskey's decision to follow that destroyer despite his fuel situation. The dive bomber pilots who held their dives through fire that turned the sky black. The damage control teams on Yorktown who worked miracles keeping their ship fighting. The radar operators who gave early warning. The code breakers who positioned the American carriers in ambush. Victory came from hundreds of decisions, large and small, made by people who understood what was at stake and refused to yield. The Dauntless gave them a weapon that rewarded precision and courage. That was enough. In 6 minutes on a June morning, American dive bomber pilots broke the back of Japanese naval power and changed the course of the Pacific War. The sound of Dauntless dive brakes, that distinctive screaming as perforated metal panels bit into the airstream to control the dive, became the sound of American victory across the Pacific. From Midway to Guadalcanal, from the Santa Cruz Islands to the Philippine Sea, that sound meant bombs were coming, and Japanese ships were about to die. It's easy to romanticize war from 80 years' distance, but the men who flew those missions weren't romantic heroes. They were scared young men who vomited before missions, who shook as they climbed into their cockpits, who saw their friends die burning in crashed aircraft or drowning in the Pacific after ditching. They flew anyway. Because duty demanded it, because their country needed it, because surrender was unthinkable, and because they flew the Dauntless, a reliable, sturdy, unglamorous aircraft that did exactly what was needed when history pivoted on 6 minutes of violence from the sky.